Today we're reviewing AMD's RX 6700 XT. It's supposed to be $480 and out on the market March 18th. So we're actually able to post the reviews a day in advance this time, which is nice because in this market, in the very least, if the reviews go out the same day, no one's going to watch the reviews. They're going to buy the card first and then decide if they want it later, because otherwise you might not get a card. So this is going up one day in advance. You do have time to actually watch this and determine whether you want the card before you buy one. And then all the partner models will be launching on the same day. So all on March 18th with a starting price of, in theory, $480 for the manufacturer's suggested price. And we'll see how that goes. But this is a 40 CU card. It is cut down quite a bit. The GPU die is actually different. The silicon's different size. We'll look at that in the teardown. Then in the 6800 and the 6800 XT cards. And today we're going to be benchmarking this for gaming, ray tracing, rasterization, thermals, frequency, power, and more. Before that, this video is brought to you by the Thermaltake Tower 100. Thermaltake's Tower 100 is a mini ITX case to serve as a showcase system for your components. The Tower 100 has received many revisions since we first saw it, and the case now has an open vent in the bottom for intake, a mesh cutout in the side panel for some GPU ventilation, and additional mesh along the side skirts and the side panels of the case. The Tower 100 is mostly focused on building a showpiece PC that's small enough to fit on most tables. Learn more at the link in the description below. So we already have a specs and news announcement video on the 6700 XT on the channel if you want to check it out. The problem with launching any video card right now is the same thing we said in the RTX 3060 review. The RTX 3060 launched into a market where the price didn't matter. It's totally irrelevant what NVIDIA sets as the price, how many they make, because they're going to sell them regardless. And so that makes it a little bit difficult to review GPUs. Typically, we lean heavily on the MSRP as a basic guide. You're expecting plus or minus $100 at most from MSRP, not whatever it is right now. And so in this market, as we said in the RTX 3060 review, you don't need to launch a good product. Your video card doesn't need to be good. It doesn't need to be competitive. All it needs to do is exist. That's how you sell a video card in this market. And unfortunately, that means there's really not as many competitive practices coming into play as usually. The manufacturers aren't pushing each other down in price because why would they? Even if one manufacturer comes in under the other one for price, they're just selling themselves short because they're going to sell the cards anyway. So what's the point of being $20 or $40 cheaper? It might be better value. This card, like the 3060, might be in kind of meh territory. We'll talk about that today. But does it matter if it's in meh territory if it's going to sell out anyway? And the answer to that is basically no. It doesn't matter because it is going to sell out. And so it doesn't matter if things aren't exciting, if they stagnate, if you end up paying $1 for 1 percentage point like you did with the 3060, and like we'll see today, mostly with this card. But anyway, the basic specs of this thing, it's 40 CUs, so it's cut down, it's a smaller die. The advertised game clock, in giant air quotes there, is 24 megahertz. We'll look at the actual frequency in reality in a little bit in charts. The memory capacity is 12 gigabytes GDDR6. That's plenty. Don't let anyone tell you you need 16 gigabytes. You barely need 12. And by the way, as a reminder, the memory number you see in GPU-Z and hardware info, whatever, that's just an allocation. For security reasons, those applications do not know how much memory is actually being used by the applications on the GPU. All they know is what's been allocated. So if the application, if GPU-Z or hardware info says 10 gigabytes, it's probably because the application requested 10 gigabytes. It doesn't mean that it's actually using that. So if it requests 10 and it gets 8, but it's only using 6, then it doesn't matter. You have enough capacity either way. Anyway, that's a separate topic, but wanted to make sure that's clear for this one. So 12 is fine for a card of this class. 6 is maybe borderline okay. Future looking though, it becomes more of a problem, especially with ray tracing in some of these applications. Board power is advertised at 230 watts. We'll do power testing in a bit. SEP again is $480. SEP is AMD's word. That means MSRP. It's prepared to cringe suggested e-tail price, but it's supposed to be $480. We're going to base our evaluation on that number, even if it's not as likely to hold, because we need to base it on something. And so we're going to go with what the companies are setting as MSRP because that tells us what they think the card is worth and where it's supposed to be positioned. So enough of that. Let's get into the benchmarks for today. We'll go through a lot of them and then talk about conclusions. We like to begin our GPU reviews with frequency validation. This helps us establish that the GPU is actually working properly and running as it should before we waste any time with testing if it's not. This chart has a truncated chart range on the left axis from 2250 to 2600 megahertz. It's helpful for visualizing differences that otherwise would be difficult to see, but keep in mind that it distorts the scale. That's intentional here. The RX 6800 XT stock card ran in the range of 2300 to 2360 megahertz. The RX 6800 non-XT held a fairly flat frequency near 2280 megahertz, and the RX 6700 XT was closer to 2560 megahertz. This is normal. Typically, AMD's lower-end Radeon cards run a higher frequency, but the reduction in cores and physical hardware is what pulls down the performance ranking. The line isn't flat, which is due to power limits and the frequency bouncing off of a wall, but this can be flattened if desired by boosting the power limit in the GPU's options through Radeon settings. But of course, then the power consumption would go up. This next chart shows the thermals and fan speed on the AMD RX 6700 XT. As a reminder, the 6800 XT reference card ran nearly at 100 degrees for its junction temperature in this test, with its average edge temperature in the range of 75 degrees. This also is a measure of VBIOS, not just the cooler, since we're showing automatic settings. With Auto VBIOS, a temperature target will dictate the fan speed more than anything else. AMD has temperature ranges in there that it's targeting, and the end result is a hot GPU core with AMD's default configuration. This is something that partners have complete control over, so you'll see this change from card to card. Let's get the 6700 XT on the chart now. The 6700 XT fan RPM at about 1700 is where we'd expect it based on previous AMD reference launches. The average edge temperature is again around 75 to 77 degrees Celsius. The junction temperature stays in the 90s, and as we'll show in Overclock Stepping, it's not shy to hit 100 degrees under the right conditions. The core can technically handle 110C here, but it'll start throttling at that point, and 100 is still warmer than it really needs to be. The delta of 25 to 30 degrees edge to junction is also a wider gulf than what we'd like to see, but this aligns with AMD's mounting pressure shortcomings and some of the shortcomings in the vapor chamber and the cold plate that we've shown previously. Here's our overclock stepping chart. This is basically a chart of our raw notes while we worked through stabilizing an overclock. AMD is still somewhat challenging to work with, and it behaves more erratically than NVIDIA does during the OC process, but we did establish a slight gain. At full stock, our baseline score was 5864 points in Port Royal, which increased by 1.3% just from setting the power limit to 115% and doing nothing else. Undervolting helped a little bit, but you'll see that our lower attempt at 1140 millivolts ended up resulting in worse performance, or in performance regression in other words. We got uplift at 1160 millivolts, and it does run below that, but it silently ends up lower in performance. So it'll work, and it won't throw a blue screen or anything, but it's not better. So just remember to always validate your overclocks or your voltage changes with actual benchmarks for performance to make sure you're not making it worse accidentally. The end result was a 5.6% uplift in Port Royal. There may be some more room in there, but we had memory errors with higher memory overclocks and stability issues with higher core clocks, so we'd really have to invest a lot of time to tune it much better than this. We'll start with something different. In Rainbow Six Siege at 1080p, we measured the AMD RX 6700 XT stock card at 371 FPS average, with lows spaced proportionally and well, at 255 FPS and 238 FPS 1% and 0.1%. The 371 result places the 6700 XT between the RTX 3070 and RTX 3060 Ti. That's below where it needs to be, really. The NVIDIA RTX 3070's MSRP is $500, so there's not enough of a price gap between the 6700 XT and the 3070 MSRP to establish a strength in this benchmark. We're still using MSRPs as a guideline or a judge because that's where the companies are intending to sell these things. That's how they value them. Everything else is just chaos, and we can't predict it for a review. But obviously, you'll need to tweak your understanding of the data based on what's available and how much it costs when you check inventory. The 6700 XT does fine. We just think it needs to be cheaper to compete in the fantasy GPU league where everything goes for actual MSRP. The 6800 outperforms the 6700 XT by about 12% here, but that goes up later, with the 6800 XT about 18% ahead of the 6700 XT. Overclock in the 6700 XT got us at 4.6% uplift, moving to 388 FPS average. At 1440p, the 6700 XT pushes 228 FPS average, enough to satisfy most high refresh displays, even at 1440p. and so it landed between the 3060 Ti and the 2080 Super. SAM or rebar would help a bit here, but we've already covered that in our 6800 XT review, and it's something that's available to both parties now. The percentages scale like this. The 6800 XT leads by 42%, the 6800 non-XT leads by 21%, and the 3070 leads by 21% without either platform using rebar. Overclocking resulted in a gain of 7.6% for the 6700 XT. At 4K, the 6700 XT ends up still doing well at 100 FPS. That's good enough to play, even for a competitive game like this one. The end result is just below the 2080 Super and allows the 3060 Ti a lead of about 20%. This is expected as NVIDIA tends to scale better as the resolution increases as compared to AMD, or again said inversely, AMD does better at 1080p than NVIDIA does proportionally. Next up is Shadow of the Tomb Raider. At 1080p, the RX 6700 XT lands at 165 FPS average, which has it above the RTX 3060 Ti and functionally equivalent to the NVIDIA RTX 3070. This is a more favorable position than in Rainbow Six Siege, and the AMD card looks a little more competitive here. The RX 6800 non-XT outdoes the new XT by 5.5%, with the RX 6800 XT outranking it by 11%. We're at a CPU bind at this level with the RTX 3080 and the RX 6800 XT, so we'll need higher resolutions to see scaling. As for overclocking, the improvement here is 3%. There's probably a little bit more in there, but we had trouble with stability across all of the games when running higher. At 1440p, FPS falls to 119 FPS average, with lows still well spaced and indicative of strong frame time consistency. The 119 FPS average result has the 6700 XT between the RTX 3070 stock and the AMD RX 6800. The RX 6800 leads the 6700 XT by 18%, with the 6800 XT leading by 38%. The overclock gave us a couple percent once again, but not much. At 4K, the 6700 XT can still play the game well with its 66 FPS average and 60 FPS 1% lows. The RTX 3070 is, again, functionally tied, the 3060 Ti is a bit behind, and the 6800 offers a meaningful uplift that's actually worth establishing this separate SKU for. The game looks much better for the 6700 XT than Rainbow Six did, which made it look poorly positioned. We'll still need more game data, though, to make an aggregate decision. Red Dead Redemption 2 is next. This one has the 6700 XT at 134 FPS average for 1080p, which has it ahead of the RTX 3070 by 9%. That's good positioning for the GPU as compared to Rainbow Six. Compared to the 5700 XT, there's a generational step here of 34%. But that is paired with a pricing increase of $80 on the 6700 XT, so it doesn't really feel like an actual improvement. When we're looking at 30% for $80 more than the previous generation with the same basic naming scheme, it starts to sort of feel like NVIDIA's RTX 3060 launch. Stagnation. As long as the GPU exists in this market, it'll sell, so no one needs to care about pushing the needle for value. At 1440p, the RX 6700 XT holds 101 FPS average, or still about 29% hiked generationally over the 5700 XT. The 6700 XT result has it functionally equivalent to the RTX 3070 and a couple percent ahead of the RTX 3060 Ti. The RX 6800 outperforms the RX 6700 XT by around 10% here, with the 6800 XT offering about a 24 to 25% uplift. The most direct NVIDIA competition would be the RTX 3060 Ti, below the 6700 XT, or the RTX 3070. Lows aren't meaningfully different between these cards, and average isn't meaningfully different between the 3070 and the 6700 XT, but the 3060 Ti does get left behind here. At 4K, Red Dead Redemption has the RX 6700 XT still in playable territory, but with 0.1% dips that start to sometimes hurt a little bit. The RTX 3070 holds a 10.5% lead at 4K, pulling away when it was otherwise equal at the lower resolutions. Generationally, AMD pushes the needle by 21% against its RX 5700 XT architecture and previous card, and the 5700 XT ends up holding on to its scaling better as the resolution is pumped upwards, or worded inversely, the 6700 XT scales better at lower resolutions than the 5700 XT did. Either way, one of those is true, and that's why we see this difference in scaling as the resolution changes. In either case, the value proposition gets worse as the resolution goes up, especially compared to previous price positioning, as now you're at a hard $1 per 1% improvement metric. Just like we talked about with the RTX 3060, that's not innovation. That's stagnation, because yes, it's better, but you're paying a proportionate amount more, so nothing's changed. That means the bar hasn't really moved, and the lower resolutions, in the very least, as some semblance of value, offer slightly better than 1-to-1 scaling. Here's a quick frame time plot. Overall, they're really not too terrible for the performance level we're getting, but there are a few small hitches. Lower is better, as always, but more consistent is best. We see a few hitches and corrections toward the beginning, where we see a plus or minus change maximally of 7 to 8 milliseconds, so it's occasionally noticeable, but it's really not too bad. We're testing using the previous patch for Cyberpunk 2077 for GPUs right now due to stability issues with the new one, but our CPU testing uses the newest patch, so they definitely can't be compared. These were all tested using the same game version, which is the important part, so they're all directly comparable in the GPU charts. At 1080p, the RX 6700 XT ran at 97 FPS average, which has it above the 5700 XT by about 19%, but it allowed the 3060 Ti a lead of about 6%. That's better positioning for the 3060 Ti than elsewhere when compared to the 6700 XT. At 1440p, the 6700 XT remained in about the same place. It's above the 5700 XT, now by 21%, while the 3060 Ti maintains a slight lead over the new AMD card. The 6800 XT offers a larger jump than elsewhere, at 41% improved over the 6700 XT. There's not much point to testing 4K with this card in this game, but it at least proves that there's not much point to doing it, because it's a stretch for Cyberpunk 2077 to play at 4K. The card ran at 31 FPS average. Anything shy of an RTX 3080 here is a rough experience in this chart. In GTA 5, we're mostly bound by the CPU at the high end, so we can't see the true difference between the 6700 XT and the 6800 XT, although there's still a clear gap against the RTX 3070. Let's move on to 1440p for more scaling insight. 1440p has the RX 6700 XT at 133 FPS average, scaling over the 5700 XT by 21%. Again, back down to about a $1 per 1% gain metric. The new trend here is that the improvements people think they're seeing generationally are being obfuscated by marketing sorcery. It's getting tough to tell when there's actually a movement forward or progression over the years versus when it just looks better on a chart if you ignore the price. Scaling overall for the 6700 XT is less impressive against its predecessor when tested in this older title, but it's also less impressive when tested at higher resolutions. So that's leaving a limited window to where we're seeing the larger gains. It's still GTA, that is, among the top played games on Steam, and many other top games are built similarly. The 3060 Ti and the RTX 3070 alike are getting outdone by the 6700 XT here, so it gets credit for defeating Nvidia's latest offerings in that sense. The 6700 XT offers a gain of about 4.3% over the RTX 3070 in GTA at this resolution, but it does move around a little bit depending on the game. At 4K, the RX 6700 XT plunges to 61 FPS average. This is now only 12% better than the 5700 XT. The RTX 3070 also passes the 6700 XT now with a 17% advantage, so a complete flip. AMD's more expensive RX 6800 non-XT holds 78 FPS average, so there's a void-like 28% lead over the 6700 XT. Fortunately, this void can be overcome with a bridge. The bridge is made out of money, but you can overcome it nonetheless. Strange Brigade will be our last rasterized benchmark. We'll look at some power and ray tracing numbers after this. At 1440p, this one ranked the 6700 XT at 185 FPS average, or 191 FPS average when overclocked. The placement is as before. It's between the RTX 3070 and the AMD RX 6800, but in a manner which is better value than both in this instance. The price still feels too high for the RX 6700 XT, just like it did for the RTX 3060, but neither company feels particularly compelled to apply competitive pressure right now. They'd just be selling themselves short in this market. At 4K, the RX 6700 XT stock card did 96 FPS average, so including the lows, it's functionally equivalent to the RTX 3070. The RX 6700 XT outdoes the 3060 Ti marginally, and the 3070 now technically surpasses it, but it's basically the same. This is the same trend we saw earlier, so lower resolutions benefit the 6700 XT more. Quake II is the first of our ray tracing games. This is the first AMD GPU we've done since the game was updated to allow launching with AMD cards. So the 6700 XT is alone on this chart amongst Nvidia's cards. The update also added support for Vulkan extensions, but the game appears to work just as well using the RTX extensions that we've used for testing all of the NVIDIA cards so far. We validated this and saw no performance difference from our test configuration, so either one seems okay here. The 6700 XT lands between the RTX 2060 KO and the 2070 XC in performance at 52 FPS average, but it had a marginally more stable 0.1% low. NVIDIA's 3060 Ti averaged 78 FPS in this test, which is a significant 52% lead over the AMD card. AMD's 6700 XT would have been competitive in ray tracing performance for this title in 2018. But it's not competitive right now, and that's especially true because it's fully path traced, so there's no rasterization to leverage with AMD's advantages. At 1440p, the 3060 Ti retains a large lead, up to 57% at 46 FPS average versus 29 for the 6700 XT. The 6700 XT may be technically capable of ray tracing, but it's not the ideal card for it. At 4K, we recorded a validation pass just to make sure our observations remained correct, and that running the benchmark with RTX extensions and KHR extensions resulted in roughly the same performance, and it did. The results were identical. The 6700 XT was limited to 13 FPS average in both instances here. Meanwhile, the 3060 Ti's advantage grew to 61% with an FPS average of 21. This advantage is largely theoretical though. Nobody wants to play Quake II at 21 FPS in 2021, but it's still technically a defeat for the 6700 XT. Tomb Raider is fairly lightweight in terms of ray traced efforts, so this one should do better for the 6700 XT. RTX shadows are the only feature enabled for this test, and that means that this is largely still rasterization. The average for the 6700 XT in this test was 84 FPS, with the 3060 Ti 15% ahead at 97 FPS. The 6700 XT makes some ground back versus Quake because of the less demanding RT effects, and specifically because it's more rasterization heavy and already advantaged at the 1080p lower resolution. At 1440p, the 6700 XT averaged 60 FPS, with the 3060 Ti 10% ahead in performance, and the 3070 21% ahead. As before, if you're interested primarily in ray tracing, you should probably buy NVIDIA. Higher render resolutions are unrealistic for this tier of card, so we'll just skip 4K and move on. Control is a game that we test using DLSS when possible, but that's not an option for any AMD cards. We have several NVIDIA entries in this chart with DLSS explicitly enabled, but we also have some results in the control benchmarks with DLSS disabled. That gives you a fair like-for-like comparison without DLSS as an advantage to look at NVIDIA versus AMD RT performance. Without DLSS, the 6700 XT averaged 49 FPS and struggled at any higher resolution. We do have some data gathered for NVIDIA cards with DLSS disabled at 4K though. The 6700 XT only managed a 15 FPS average here, but this clearly isn't resolution that this card is meant for, with RT at least. We're only looking at these results for the sake of comparison. For relative scaling, the 6700 XT is just slightly behind the 3060 non-Ti here, while the Ti is 48% ahead, and we've got the DLSS and non-DLSS results for many of these cards to help with a like-for-like or a realistic comparison. Minecraft RTX is another game that we test with DLSS on when given the option, but we are forced to run at full render resolution with AMD GPUs. Nothing above 1080p was playable, and even the 1080p test result averaged an unpleasantly low 31 FPS. The 3060 Ti ran this same test with DLSS disabled at 67 FPS average, or 114% ahead of AMD's GPU. Again, the 6700 XT is capable of ray tracing, but it isn't the card's strong suit. It did better in Tomb Raider, where we really only have one RT feature to worry about. Finally, for power consumption, we'll keep it short. In a power virus workload, the RX 6700 XT maxed out at 219 watts, right below the RTX 3070's stock result. The RTX 3060 stock card pulled 200 watts in the same workload, so everything makes sense. Given the positioning in the hierarchy, there's nothing out of line with these results. We also checked the PCIe slot draw, and that looked fine too. So about 219 watts for total card power is what you end up with the 6700 XT. Closing out then, frankly, this card, like the RTX 3060, is whatever. It's hard to get excited about them right now. And this isn't just trying to play to the cheap seats. This isn't pandering to the audience, because that is what a lot of people want to hear. They don't want to see someone talk about how great a video card is, how great value it is, because everybody's going to be disappointed when they can't buy one. But this isn't trying to play to that emotion. In all actuality, it is just sort of disappointing to look at the RTX 3060 and then to look at this as reviewers, because you're looking at this thing and the 3060 going, okay, cool. So in FPS numbers, it's 20–30% better than the previous model with the same name minus 1,000 in the SKU, so the 5700 XT. That's cool. That's uplift. It sounds good. But then you look at the price and realize, oh, okay, so it's $1 for 1%. Great. That means we're in the same spot we were when the 5700 XT launched, or when the 2060 launched, or the other cards before them. So price creep, it's going to happen anyway. But this is far outpacing inflation, first of all. And ultimately, the name is just a name. So the manufacturers decide that, well, 57, the 700 XT line, we're going to bump that up to a higher class of performance and slot something in under it where the previous one was. The thing is, though, when they slot something in under this, like let's say a 6700 non-XT, 6600, 6500, whatever, when it is inevitably the same price that the 5700 XT was at launch, ignoring the later years pricing of the card, which was lower, when it comes in at the same price point, and it's the same performance, or very slightly different, plus RT hardware, the real response to that is who cares? That's complete stagnation. And it's just not interesting, and this isn't good enough from NVIDIA or AMD. So not mad at NVIDIA or AMD, just exceptionally disappointed. However, not surprised, because in this market, as we said in the intro to this piece, AMD and NVIDIA would be selling themselves short if they actually brought the pricing down in a way that was either, one, in this case, more competitive with a 3070, or two, more competitive with their own first-party previous offerings. There's no incentive to do it because they're going to sell it, and they'd be selling their shareholders short, and that's what matters for this type of operation. So it's fine. Just like the RTX 3060, it's fine. And it's hard to lean one way or the other more than that, because unless you're watching this in months from now and supply is stabilized, it doesn't matter today. The answer to what you buy today is what's in stock. And short of buying something exceptionally bad, like say some of the Zotac ones where the thermal pads literally don't touch the components, there's not a lot of things you should just hard avoid, because hard avoiding typically means you have other options. In this case, hard avoiding means the card is so garbage that it's going to cause you problems later down the line, and this isn't that. So the conclusion is it's fine. That's it for this one. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more as always. You can go to store.gamersnexus.net to pick up one of our toolkits or mouse mats. They're in stock. We have them. We have more stock than billion-dollar companies now. Or you can go to patreon.com/gamersnexus. Thanks for watching. We'll see you all next time.